Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialise in websites for counsellors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counsellors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 290 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Our insightful guest today is Dorothy Hodgkinson, who has a first-class honours degree in counselling from York St John University, a certificate in independent advocacy, including a specialism in independent advocacy for vulnerable adults. She's a member of the Safeguarding Adults in Care Homes Guidelines Committee and a director of Queer Arts UK. Dorothy joined us today to speak about a lecture she has given for the Counsellor CPD Library on the subject of working with transgender people. So with that said, let's get on with today's episode.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
How are you doing, Ken?
Oh, well, thank you for asking, Rory, and both Rory and I are delighted you've joined us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast, episode 290, starting our journey today with ethical, sustainable practice, where we're going to look at 5 reasons to do some really formal CPD to be a trauma-informed counsellor. We then move on to Practice Matters, where Rory is doing that interview with Dorothy Hodgkinson that he mentioned in the introduction, and that is on working with transgender people. And then we're going straight into Student Services today, and we're going to be looking at why students should have their own insurance. So that's what you can expect from episode 290. Starting off, Rory, with that ethical, sustainable practice, 5 reasons to become a trauma-informed counsellor. And here's something that comes to mind for me immediately, Rory, is that during our core counselling training, trauma may be mentioned from time to time, but there's no really deep study or learning of that. And when I look at actual real life practice, and I'm speaking about from basically stepping into placement, it is likely that trauma is going to present within the therapy room in one form or another. And it kind of feels like there's a gap in that training.
Yeah, I would totally agree, Ken. Certainly, when I trained many years ago, I was struck about how the client presentation and what I've been trained in was completely different. So I had a very good placement who really handpicked the clients for students, but still I got clients who were traumatized. And I think part of the reason for this is a lot of the meta models of therapy that are taught now, they're very good meta models. However, lots of them are based in the 1950s, our 1950s and 1960s. Our understanding of trauma has really gone leaps and bounds, in the 21st century, 2000, 2021. A lot of information and understanding of trauma. And I'll give you a telling statistic, Ken, a couple of telling statistics. Carl Rogers died in 1987. He died in 1987. It was only in 1980 did post-traumatic stress disorder become an actual diagnosable thing. Now, I know as therapists we don't diagnose, but it says that it was 7 years before Rogers died, and he'd finished his person-centered design of the person-centered helping model many years before that. It was involved in a lot of other things. However, it was only then that clinicians were realizing that people were presenting with a cluster of symptoms that equaled trauma. And in September of 2023, I did a little survey in our Facebook group. Now, if you're not a member of our Facebook group, put Counselling Tutor into Facebook, you'll find us and you can come in, and there's thousands of us and you can have a conversation. And one of the questions I asked, I did a quick survey and I asked this question: how much trauma-informed information did you receive as a student? And I got 100 responses, which is really good. If, like me, you're not very good at maths, you can work the percentages out really quickly, yeah? And 52% said none at all. None at all, 52%. Wow. 41% said some, but not enough. And 7% said it was well covered. So 7 out of 100 people who graduated courses who'd done this survey, and it went in front of I think about 1,300 people, had only got enough information, thought it was well covered. So, 93% of people didn't have enough information, or none at all. And you're meeting trauma on a day-to-day basis. I speak to therapists, and it's becoming something that is now more profound in practice. It's not something that's hidden. And the reason it's not hidden, Ken, is that clients have a vocabulary for it because their clients are a little bit more well-informed. And also, I think there's a lot more traumatizing things around. We've got all sorts of stuff going on, and people are getting traumatized. So I think there is a compelling reason. I think there are some compelling reasons to become trauma-informed practitioner, Ken.
I like it. It's a good topic. It's an evergreen topic. It's not something that's going to go away. Trauma is always presented in our therapy rooms. I think we just have different language and different ways of recognizing that now, and certainly different ways of working with it and checking the approach that we use in meeting somebody who may present with trauma. And we're covering today 5 compelling reasons to become a trauma-informed counsellor. So I'm going to do a quick overview and give you what the 5 are, and then we're going to dig a little bit deeper into these. So number 1 is to deepen your understanding of trauma's impact. Number 2 is to acquire a specialized skill set and a set of techniques, and that is really important. It's not, it can lie outside of our core training. Number 3 is ethical and empathic client engagement. Number 4 is respond to a critical social need, and critical it should be underlined here. And number 5 is personal and professional development. So there's the 5, but let's dive into them and start with number 1, and that's to deepen your understanding of trauma's impact. So basically, we're speaking about embracing that comprehensive perspective on how trauma affects individuals at various levels, and getting an enhanced understanding that goes beyond just what we learn in our core training, so that we're able to go further with our clients. And I think that just recognizing trauma as a presentation, it can show itself in various different ways, Rory. And what our perspective or our mindset might be on trauma might be very different to how a client presents and what they recognized as trauma within their life. And I'm going to take 2 examples here. You may have a client who presents who lost a pet bird when they were a boy, and they are still affected by the trauma of that to this very day. And I'm using Chris Packham here. So if you know Chris Packham, he is a presenter on television here in the United Kingdom, and that is actually his story. He had a pet bird when he was a young boy. He loved this bird. He developed a great bond to this bird, and when it passed away, it really affected him in a massive way. He experienced trauma from that he still lives with today. So it's about understanding how it shows and not having a predefined kind of box that trauma fits in this box here.
Yeah, and that's an interesting one, Ken, isn't it? Because I mean, if you ask a lot of people, certainly the person on the back of the Clapham omnibus, and you ask them what is trauma, they may point to military trauma.
Yeah.
Because a lot of trauma and our understanding of trauma has been generated from wars. You know, it's been generated from soldiers coming back from conflicts such as, you know, well, the First World War, that's a classic one, isn't it? That was Soldier's Heart. And the Second World War, combat fatigue, and Vietnam, and the list goes on and on and on. And people probably are reluctant to believe that you could have trauma through other things. And I think one of the reasons that we need to deepen our understanding of trauma's effect is because, first of all, clients may not always tell us they've had a traumatic event. They may come to us talking about something else that's happened that's a byproduct of the traumatic event. And if we have an understanding of how trauma plays out, it's certainly the psychological and physical emotional responses, we can get more attuned. So we don't have to take any action, but we can prepare ourselves for what might be disclosed later on in the therapy session. So that's important. And I also want to say there's a little bit of a difference between anxiety and trauma. Anxiety is where someone's afraid of a bit afraid of doing something. Trauma is where you're getting things like sleepless nights, physical responses, flashbacks, that type of thing. And we have to be careful we don't label everything as trauma. We don't kind of medicalize our clients. But once we understand how trauma presents, certainly physically, because trauma physically impacts the body, then we have an understanding when a client comes to us that we may possibly, A, be dealing with trauma, and B, further on down the road, we might have a disclosure.
Thank you. Yes, very, very much so. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an overview of why it's so important for us to deepen our understanding of trauma's impact and how trauma might show and how it might show differently in different people. And then we go on to reason number 2, compelling reasons to become a trauma-informed counselor. Number 2 is to acquire a specialized skill set, specialized techniques for working once we identify and trauma presents. And this is, as we've kind of said, it is a specialized skill set. We need to first understand how this presents and then how to work with this delicately and in service of the client. And Rory, you have built a trauma-informed practice course. It has been kind of trialing and being refined for over a year. And I've got it open in front of me. So if you're interested in joining Rory's trauma-informed practice course, we'll give you info on that in a little while. But basically, we're talking about 30 different lessons, 30 lessons, Rory, all on trauma. And it starts about safety and looking at your own safety, defining what trauma looks like, how it presents in the mind and body, signs that we might recognize of trauma. As you've mentioned, Rory, somebody might not come in and say, I'm here because I want counseling around my trauma. It might be something else. It might be a clue they give us. Trauma recovery methods, a number of methods to work with. Trauma from a cultural perspective, how that might show, working with dissociation, and then you've got some bonus materials in there in kind of self-help such as breath work, and then of course what the research says and how we might use our supervision for trauma. So this all comes back to acquiring a specialized skills and techniques. It's not just what we know, there's more.
Yeah, absolutely. And within that course, Ken, I actually hired an actor to play the role of a client, and I demonstrated some trauma-informed interventions when the client, or the actor, the client, was disassociating in the room, how to bring them back into the here and now. And those are the specialized skills and techniques. And one thing I learned early on in my practice was I was very fortunate enough to have a supervisor who'd spent a lot of time working with a cohort of clients who'd experienced a huge amount of trauma. And I was taking a client's supervision and explaining that this client was, beating themselves up and, not physically, but emotionally, because, they'd got into this flight, fight, or freeze response, and they were blaming themselves because they didn't run away and they didn't fight. And my supervisor said, well, why don't you tell them about how the brain works? I'm like, well, I'm not sure I can do that. I'm not a doctor. And she said, well, the client is really struggling here. This information is readily available. And we worked together. And when I saw the client again, I just said, look, I said, the part of your brain that deals with threat management saw what was happening and made a decision. And unfortunately, that part of the brain doesn't have an executive function. It does it automatically. It's a primitive brain technique. And I remember the client just leaning back in the chair, and she said, so it's not my fault. So I said, no. I said, your body was responding how it was meant to respond. It took the best view of survival. I said, no, unfortunately, that part of the brain isn't connected to the other part of the brain that replays the memories. I said, but that's how the body works. It's been known for a long time. And that trauma-informed intervention changed everything for the client.
Yeah.
The client went away with a huge burden lifted. She no longer believed that she was responsible because she lacked in action or lacked the ability to fight back. What she did was she just said, so that's how my body responds. Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's part of being a trauma-informed practitioner, Ken.
Yeah, that's psychological education and not really normalizing, but normalizing. Say, that is normal. You weren't in control in that situation. Really, really powerful. Because, of course, we can look back on incidents in our own lives and beat ourselves up about how we may have acted within a certain circumstance. But so often, that acting within that moment, in the there and then, we may have had very little control over that because there are parts of our brain, when we understand the brain, how the brain really functions, that take over. They take over. We don't have the time to kind of work things out. So our brain goes to a default response that it sees in that moment as being the most of service to us in that moment. And we can later on look back on that and ask, why didn't I? Why did I? Why did that play out the way it does? And almost feel a responsibility and almost like we made a decision in that moment. And that's just an example of that. And that is, I guess, the importance of acquiring that specialized skills and techniques. It brings us on to number 3, which is the ethical and empathic client engagement. We say often on this podcast, Rory, that the client can only go as far as the counsellor is able to go. As soon as there is an unknown area for us as a counsellor, we cannot go there. So we can't go there with the client, so it kind of holds them back. So if we're looking at ethical and empathic client engagement here, Rory, number 3.
Absolutely. And I think that any training enlarges the ability for a therapist to access a client's frame of reference. Being empathic means you're trying to see the world as the client sees it, and you can only do that if you have a bit of an understanding of what the client's telling you. Now, there are some things you probably wouldn't be able to go into the client's frame of reference with, but with traumatic incidents, there can be very, very subtle interplays, how the body reacts afterwards, how they view the world. And I mean, I'll give you another example. Many years ago, I met someone who was convinced that their former boyfriend who was abusive was actually in the college I was teaching in and was waiting to attack her. And I knew this student, and I said to her, you told me that he was in prison for 5 years. And she said, yes. I said, and it's unlikely to let him out. And we even got to the point where we got security to do a sweep of the building. And it was the fact that she just had a triggering moment. The person who perpetrated the violence was sitting in a prison cell and would be for a very long time in a prison, a long way away from where my college was. But she'd had a triggering moment. Now, because if you're trauma informed, you can then start to take a view. It's not unusual for clients to say this. I've seen him on the street. He might be outside, and you can start to take a view on what action you need to take, but also on the reality of the situation. If the client has said, for instance, the person who abused me was 50 years old when I was a child, and the person now in front of you, the client, is 40. That would make them 90 years old, probably not around. So the idea that they could still be around is probably not going to happen. But people will slip back into the past.
Yeah.
And part of being a trauma-informed practitioner is to gently bring them back into the here and now. And it's knowing when they've slipped back into the past, knowing as they slip away into the past, and how to engage with that, and to be able to hold them emotionally, to be able to hold the space, and to be able to bring them back into the room so that they're in the here and now, not the there and then. And that can, in my experience, fosters a safe, respectful and collaborative approach, and really, really strengthens the therapeutic alliance. It brings the potential for someone to move on and be able to support themselves from the traumatic event. But if you don't understand the process of that, then it can be confusing. And I also think that if you don't work with it, then it can kind of fracture the alliance a bit.
Yeah.
So I think it's essentially. I did my trauma informed course many years ago, and I have to say, when I was in practice, I was pulling on it all the time. I was pulling on those levers that I learned all the time.
Yeah, and it's going back to that knowledge you acquired from doing the training for it. Being able to recognize when the client is in the here and now, or when they may have slipped. So important, because if we go back into the there and then with the client and start working with them there, that is not ethical. That is not in service of the client. No. We want to be in the here and now. So being able to know that difference, and that comes from the training. So it does have a very firm base in our ethical practice. And then the next one, number 4, is respond to a critical social need. And I think that this is so important. There is a need. It is critical. You've chosen a great word there. This day and age, trauma is presenting more and more and more. And there's 2 sides to this coin. This topic we're discussing now falls within our section called ethical sustainable practice. And as counselors, we need to go out and we need to have an ethical practice, but we also need a sustainable practice. We need to be able to earn a living as a counsellor, and having specialist skills where you are able to serve or work within niche areas such as trauma, it does open a new client base for you as well, because you understand how that is, how to work with those people, how to see that. So that we've looked at the ethical side, but also there's such a need now. And I think clients are becoming more informed. They might recognize that they do have trauma, and they might be looking for a practitioner who is trained in trauma, Rory.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the critical societal needs an interesting one. When I did my research for my qualification, I did my research on trauma. And the traumatic event that I researched was the Union Carbide explosion in Bhopal. I think it's in India, and the impact, the post-traumatic impact. And what was really interesting, I'd say interesting, but telling, I think I'll use the word telling, given the subject matter, was that there was secondary trauma that people who had witnessed the event, not was in it, had witnessed the event, and they had secondary trauma. And that is not unusual at all. And as I said at the top of the podcast, trauma's becoming more prevalent. And I wonder if it's because we live in the internet age. We can see traumatic things all the time. You turn on the news, you turn on YouTube, you turn on all sorts of things. You can see some pretty horrible things. And those can either trigger you, you can see it and be triggered. Or, and I think more to the point, people who've had very difficult backgrounds or abusive backgrounds may be able to compartmentalize what's happened and get on with their life. And then all of a sudden, they look at a news report where it's someone like them, and that's it. They're triggered again. So I think that becoming trauma-informed is really important, because I'm speaking to lots of therapists, and they're saying that the amount of people coming through the door with trauma-related is more. And I'm going to make another point. I had a very telling conversation with a colleague who is a trauma-informed practitioner, and I'm talking top of her profession. She's really on point, and she said to me that community mental health teams and traditional mental health support don't touch trauma. They'll have a look at everything else, but not trauma. They expect a specialist to look at it.
Yeah.
And she's been referred a numerous amounts of people who have been to the community mental health team, and they've said, we really can't touch trauma. It needs to be a specialist thing. So you really are filling a vital gap in mental health services. It really is a big gap, Ken.
Yeah, thank you, Rory. And that brings us on to our final point number 5, which is personal and professional development. Journeying into trauma-informed counselling is an opportunity for, of course, profound personal and professional growth, and it's going to enhance your own self-awareness, your emotional intelligence and resilience, and of course equip you with a deeper understanding of your reactions to stress and trauma within your own life. And this growth doesn't only benefit you and your practice, but it also enriches your personal life, Rory. And of course, you have, in preparing to formally launch, I guess, the Trauma-Informed Practice course through Counselling Tutor, you have done some running of this course, and you've heard feedback from people how it has really impacted their personal and professional development. Of course, we're not going to speak about that, but that's part of training. We often see the training as being only in service of our practice and our clients, but so often the growth we experience within ourselves is profound.
Yes, and I'll talk about the course, but also I'll talk about my experience of teaching students, through the years. And I have to say that, with any counselling training, people are more likely to revisit parts of their personal life that they've compartmentalised, that are just leaking, that they cannot compartmentalize anymore, that they need to get help with. And I'm sure since we've run this kind of trial of the Trauma-Informed Practice course, there's been quite a few people have gone on to have their own therapy, or at least talk about what's happened to them.
Yeah.
And that is so helpful. I mean, being able to talk about it, being able to share it, being able to, remove the guilt. There's a huge amount of guilt with trauma. It just goes hand in hand. And also, I think that it kind of enhances your day-to-day activities. My wife, who I've mentioned many times before, who always calls me so philosophical, says, what do you see in that person? And sometimes I can meet not a client, but you can meet someone socially, and you think, oh dear, I wonder what's going on there. You can be more, I don't know. I don't like using the word kind, but you can be more thoughtful, and you can be more aware of what people are going through. I think it's one of those unfortunate things as a therapist that you can see more once you've been trained.
Yeah.
It's very difficult to turn off, but it is very handy to be able to, engage with someone and realize that they may be going through a difficult time. And it could be a relative, in which case you may want to, help your signpost some support. And I also think that it allows you as an individual, certainly since I've become trauma informed, to be more thoughtful about looking after myself and really putting in self-care, because unfortunately it's like, being a therapist is like being a gearbox. You get wear and tear. And unless you kind of regularly oil yourself, I'm really milking the metaphor of gearbox here for all it's worth. Unless you really oil yourself and make sure you get a routine maintenance, eventually all those cogs is going to snap. So, the oil here is self-care, is making sure you're looking after yourself, maybe having your own therapy, maybe thinking, I'd like to look at that and just explore it. So I think there's so many benefits to becoming a trauma-informed practitioner. Obviously, our main focus is the client, but I think with any training, it always enriches and helps us grow, Ken.
Get Rory's super duper handout, 5 compelling reasons to become a trauma-informed counsellor. And you can get that by going to counsellingtutor.com, clicking on the podcast tab, make your way to today's episode. That's episode 290, and right there on that page you can download that handout. And if you're listening to this and you are a qualified practitioner, you've maybe have a little bit of maturity in your practice, that you've been out and you've done some a good number of client hours, and you think to yourself, you know what, maybe I would like to train to become a trauma-informed counsellor. I can tell you a little bit about Counselling Tutor's training program for that. Number one, we run this as a cohort training, which means that there is a combination of live tutor-led training that it takes place over 3 separate days that are spread out to give you time in between to kind of process what you are learning. It is also pinned by a really comprehensive 30-hour course that contains all of the theory and practice related to what you're going to be covering in the lives. So within those lives, you'll be able to see the theory kind of coming to life. You'll be able to ask questions, and you'll be able to work with peers and kind of looking at how you might integrate trauma-informed practice in your practice. So we wanted a more comprehensive course than just something that you go and watch that's pre-recorded and tick some boxes, because there's a lot of nuance. And I think with what we've covered just today, Rory, it's an important topic, and it's a topic that we need to take seriously. So we are here at Counselling Tutor, and if you're interested in taking that training, go to counsellingtutor.com. Right there on our front page, just scroll down a little bit, you'll see trauma-informed practice. Go and put your name on the waiting list, and then what we will do is we will send you the handbook and upcoming dates. You can look through the handbook, see if the training is for you, and you can look at the dates to see if they align with your diary if you're interested in taking that training. And of course, like all of the Counselling Tutor courses that we offer, there is a flexible payment plan structured around that as well to make it more affordable. So that is ethical, sustainable practice for today. And we now move out of ethical, sustainable practice, and we go into practice matters. There's the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor podcast. You can definitely put it down on your CPD tracker that you listen to this part of the podcast. And of course, Rory, you met up with Dorothy Hodgkinson, working with transgender people.
Yes, transgender community is certainly one that has come to prominence in recent years, a hidden community, I think, for a long time, and one now that is now being more seen. Visibility, I think, is the term used. And I spoke with Dorothy Hodgkinson, who is someone who works with transgender people and has a very informed view of how we may develop our practice to be able to support them. I met up with her, and this is what she had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Diversity and working with diverse groups is such an important part of our profession and the work we do on a daily basis. And it's really incumbent on us to be aware of different areas of diversity. And as I always say, meet the client where they are. So I'm delighted to be speaking to Dorothy Hodgkinson, who's done a fantastic lecture on working with transgender people. So Dorothy Hodgkinson, thank you so much for joining us.
Pleasure, glad to be here.
Now, I guess a cursory view of the media, certainly in the UK, would paint the transgender community in quite a damning light. I think that would probably not understate it too much. And I guess part of your lecture was to kind of enlighten people about the realities of people who are transgender. Would that be a fair assumption?
Yes, absolutely. I think certainly in recent years, the anti-trans rhetoric has gained huge strength and has actually caused immense distress and fear. It's also increased the rate of hate crime towards trans individuals. I mean, only the other week there was an announcement from, I think it was at the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, that said hate crime against trans individuals had gone up 11% in the last year. And it's gone up something like 180-something% in the last 5 years. The more media coverage there is, the more the hate grows, the more the discrimination grows, which is really worrying because they are already marginalised within a very marginalised group, the LGBTQ plus group. So the media hype really does cause harm. And that was a big motivation for me in doing this lecture, to try to put a healthier balance of perspective, a broader balance that actually shows some of the real challenges that trans individuals can be up against. I'm not saying they all are. There are some very successful professionals within the trans community, but there are a lot of people out there really fearful, really worried, frightened for their own lives.
Gosh, that's quite a strong statement, isn't it? Frightened for their own lives, and if you go onto certain social media platforms, let's say the popular press, there's a huge amount of dog whistling and demonising of transgender individuals. So I guess my first question is, where do therapists go to get balanced information that would help them? Obviously, viewing the lecture is going to be of a great help. Bit of a plug here, but generally speaking, if we're surrounded by that negative press, that negative ideas, then obviously it could permeate into our practices. So where will we find balanced factual information that will help us engage with transgender clients?
That's a tough one in some respects, because two sources I'm going to name probably don't sound balanced. They probably sound like they're the other side of whatever divide you're looking at. But I would suggest the Stonewall website, which I do think actually gives a very balanced approach. They tackle all issues relating to everyone under the LGBTQ plus umbrella, but there are some really helpful blogs and articles and pieces of information, transgender community and their experiences, and also with lots of signposting to other resources online that you could access from Stonewall. The other website that I've used quite a few times is actually called Transactual. I think it's .org, but again, it's clear information and it supports individuals who may be trans in finding information about what happens with that whole transition process. Is it a one-stop for everything, or is it staged, and how far do they have to go? So there's a lot of helpful information there. And I think in terms of therapists and counsellors who may be working with transgender individuals, go and do the research, go and look this stuff up, find out the reality of what they're dealing with. And that was part of the rationale behind the lecture as well. Just actually inform yourself, educate yourself about what's actually going on, rather than what other people might suggest is going on. But Transactual and Stonewall, those two websites will give you a mountain of information. You could spend a lot of time there really usefully researching.
Yeah, and I think obviously getting factual information, you talked about in the Office of National Statistics, which, I think there's very little debate in the veracity of the information there. I'm sure there will be some people who say it's not accurate, but very, very few. It's seen as a trusted and reliable source of statistical information on huge amounts of things. I was looking at it the other day regarding suicide rates. It's a very, very strong resource. I mean, I guess that one of the things that therapists may encounter is that obviously someone may transition whilst they're in therapy. It's possible. I've had supervisees where clients have appeared in a male gender, and then through the arc of therapy has transitioned into a female gender. And I think that's something, if you're working in that area, or you're working with transgender clients, that's something that happens more often than not. That would be my experience of a from supervising therapists who've worked with people in the transgender community. Would that be an accurate observation, do you think?
I think it's probably one version across a spectrum of experiences.
Yeah.
And it does depend on what stage the individual client is at, because if they're very early in wondering whether they are transgender, they may not have the confidence to make that transition. What's often talked about as the social transition. You change your appearance socially, even if you've not gone through physical or surgical changes. So the social transition is one thing that, I used to co-facilitate a trans group on a weekly basis in the first year of the lockdowns, the pandemic. And what we found there was that a lot of people were afraid of even doing the social transition. So they would resist dressing as the gender of preference, if I can put it that way, because they were fearful of the reaction and the response they would get from others. I think what strikes me as really lovely and powerful as a testimony to that particular supervisee's work is they'd engendered a safe enough environment for that client to have the confidence to make that transition during the process of therapy. I think the challenge is that transition is so much more than simply changing how you appear to the outside world. And it's everything through, if I can be fairly graphic, there's bodily hair removal, there is actual surgery, there's the emotional transition and change that accompanies all of this. But there's also the time delays. One of the things I did cover in brief in the workshop was the whole issue of when you finally have enough courage to go to your GP and say, I believe I'm transgender, I believe I'm in the wrong body. What do I do with this? Where do I go? The GP could do a referral to one of the gender dysphoria clinics, and you could be facing a 4 to 5 year wait before you get your initial assessment, where they will determine whether you have gender dysphoria, which is what they require for you to be able to access gender transition treatments. So you've got a very long time lag of, do I socially transition while I wait? Or do I not? Have I got the confidence to do that? Is my working environment safe enough for me to do that in? Or my educational environment, whatever it might be. So there are a lot of different things that can slow down the process and can really make it incredibly challenging. And it's already a very slow, clunky process.
Yes.
4 or 5 year wait just to get an initial assessment.
Gosh.
And you could be coming down at that point.
Gosh, that's an incredibly long wait, isn't it? 4 to 5 years. And you talk about developing a safe environment. Is there anything that therapists can actively do, whether it be in their advertising material or indeed in their own practices, to broadcast a sense of that acceptance? Is there anything that's helpful here?
I think that, again, it's a challenge how you can word this. I think some statement around being gender aware or trans aware might be supportive of that. I think also, a lot of therapists, I think the majority of us, we kind of list CPD that we've done to demonstrate areas that we've done extra work and study in. And I think if they can actually note that they've either, say, watched this lecture or they've watched YouTube videos that talk about this issue to demonstrate their awareness of this, that in itself is a starting point. I think also there are organisations out there where you can do CPD absolutely around gender identity, whether it's solely trans or slightly broader than that within the LGBT community. So again, I'd check out what there is online, do a search under gender identity, under transgender, under CPD, and just find what kind of content suits you as a practitioner that you're able to engage with and take on board, and that you're then going to be able to actually give off in session with clients, if you see what I mean.
Yes, yeah, and I think it comes down to, if you're working with any area of therapy that needs a deeper understanding. I mean, CPD is something that people should engage in all the time, in my view. It shouldn't just be 30 hours a year. I think people, I know I'm engaged in CPD all the time. I'm very fortunate. It's my full-time job, reading, researching, going to conferences, that type of thing. But I do think that if you are going to be, an ally, you're going to promote yourself into the community, you've got to show that you've done the work to some extent. It's no good just saying, I'm LGBTQI plus friendly. I think you've got evidence, what awareness that you bring to that statement in your advertising, I guess.
Absolutely. And I suppose the other thing is, a lot of counsellors these days will put blogs and podcasts out on their social media channels. So invite a transgender individual to come and talk with you on your podcast, or go to your local Pride March and talk with people there and find out about it. Find out about more than just trans, but go and find out. Search out the flags. I mean, I think Transactual will show you the trans flag, because all the different branches within the LGBT community, they've got loads and loads of different flags to indicate which particular identity they fall under. Look up Transactual, find the flag, and go to your local Pride when it's on. Meet the people, talk to the real people. Don't just take what the media tell you. Go and talk to an actual person. But remember, when you meet a transgender individual, you are meeting one transgender individual. One person does not represent all of them. They're each unique human beings with different experiences, but some generalities that do cross over.
Yeah, I think that's a good axiom anyway, isn't it? I'm neurodiverse, and I always say once you've met one neurodiverse person, you've met one neurodiverse person. And it's the same. Well, it's the same for humanity. Once you met one person, you met one person. There really is no difference there. And I think what we're really speaking about is labelling, isn't it? This idea that I met one person, and that must be how everybody is. And of course, there's a great danger there that you stereotype, and you don't get the nuance of the difference of people. You miss them.
Absolutely. And I think, I was really fortunate to spend that year working with that trans group. It gave me such an eye-opening. It was the biggest period of learning for me, being within that group. And I often used to wonder, am I the right person to be here? Because I'm not LGBT myself. And a couple of colleagues there, they said, no, absolutely, you are an ally. You're almost the A in LGBTQIA and all the other letters that follow on. And I know the A usually is asexual, but a couple of colleagues would say to me, no, you're absolutely right to be in here. And sometimes we need outsiders' voices. We need allies' voices to help our own voice be heard. And I think that's another element behind the lecture is, if you can watch and listen to that lecture, if you can absorb and reflect on the points I've put across, that will make you a stronger ally, simply by understanding more, knowing more, appreciating more. But then practice being an ally ongoing. Don't let it just be a one-off. And that in itself will strengthen you and your relationships with others, and will strengthen against the sort of unconscious bias that we often hear talked about. It is about informing and educating yourself so that you can be a strong ally, and then you can be a voice. But make sure you check in with them. Am I saying what they want me to say? So like some of the examples I gave in my lecture came from actual work as an advocate and a group facilitator with the community. But I checked with particular individuals and said, look, are you okay if I use the content of what's happened for you? I won't identify you, but the content. And they'll go, absolutely, yes, please do, because people need to know, people need to hear. So there's something about allies actually then strengthen the voice of the marginalised community. And again, that's any marginalised community. Like you said, the neurodiverse community, could be the disabled community. It's the same principle.
Yeah, absolutely. And, and I also think that there's a huge power in someone who's not part of the community, having a voice and speaking up. As I speak, I'll at the time of recording this podcast, I'm 65, heading towards 60. So I'll be a pensioner soon. Can you believe that? And in my youth, a lot of people spoke up for the black community. They would say, no, that's wrong. You can't do that. And I wouldn't take away the the struggle and the self direction of individual communities to formulate themselves and to find a voice and to find their place in society. I do think that, as the advert says, every little helps, really, doesn't it?
It does. And, when you think we're not just talking about here in a particular region of England, we're talking about worldwide.
Yes.
These issues are around. And when you think about the countries overseas where being LGBT is actually illegal and you can be imprisoned or sentenced to death simply for being LGBT, we haven't quite got that here, thank heavens, but that is very real still in the current world that we're living in. Yes. So the more we can speak up in support of such a threatened group, I don't know, it hopefully can only help.
Yes, it's hard to believe in the as we hurtle into the 21st century that there are 19 countries. I did some research the other day. 19 countries in the world where being gay or LGBT is illegal, and there's 3 that executes gay and LGBTQ people.
Absolutely.
And that's kind of really hard to believe in the 21st century. As we come to the end of our time together, people who view the lecture, which is available in the CPD library, our CPD library, what do you hope people will take away from the lecture?
My biggest hope is that it increases their awareness and knowledge of the reality of life for too many transgender individuals, and that it helps them to appreciate that everything they hear in the media is not necessarily the truth or a full version of the truth. And unfortunately, there is a huge amount of bias out there in the big wide world. So I think mostly it's that they have a better understanding and awareness and knowledge of the kinds of issues that transgender individuals are up against. And I think, as we've just been talking, that they become strong allies. I know not everybody will necessarily work in this field, won't be relevant to everybody, but for those watching the lecture, listening to this, they presumably already have some interest in the general field that we're talking about. So I think for me, the big hope is that they become strong allies and can connect with their local transgender community and explore with those individuals, what is it they want? What is it that they need? What is it they want help with? How can they best be spoken up for or empowered to speak for themselves? Because that's the ultimate goal, is empowering them to speak for themselves. But sometimes that's not going to be realistic. So how can the ally best speak for them?
Well, I think on that very passionate call to action, Dorothy Hodgkinson's Working with Transgender People is available in the Counsellor CPD library. And Dorothy Hodgkinson, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to Dorothy. A massive thank you for you, Rory, for reaching out and holding those all-important interviews that bring us the information that kind of informs our practice in service of our clients. And of course, if you want to hear more of what Dorothy has to say, Dorothy did a complete lecture which is available in our Counselor CPD library. If you're a member, log in and you can enjoy that. If you're not yet a member, just go to counsellingtutor.com. Right there on the front page, just click on CPD library and all the details are there. And a hint, it costs less than the price of a cup of coffee out with a friend to join the CPD library. So go and check it out. There are absolutely hundreds and hundreds of really top quality CPD lectures within that library for you. Now we move on to our all-important student services, Rory. We recognise the journey of the student. We recognise the ebbs, the flows of training to become a counsellor, and we see the future of counselling sits with you, our student listeners, and we're so glad that you do join us for the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Have you ever wondered if you're using counselling skills effectively? Confidentiality means we rarely see skills used by others, so it's no wonder that so many students say they lack confidence in their counselling skills. That's why I built Counselling Skills Academy. Counselling Skills Academy is an online course that you can do at your own pace. It will give you the skills competence and confidence to know that you're using your skills most effectively. You will see real counselling skills used by a counsellor in real life sessions, covering everything from how risk is assessed right through to working towards an appropriate ending. Visit counsellingskillsacademy.com to learn more and to claim your Counselling Tutor discount. That's counsellingskillsacademy.com. A question that comes up so often, specifically those early steps into placement. Well, do I need my own insurance for this, but the agency's got insurance? Do I need to get my own, Rory?
No, yes, it's an interesting question, and I think we should acknowledge right at the top of this piece, Ken, that there's a lot of cost in training to be a counsellor. There's a huge amount of cost, and insurance is another cost. But the thing with insurance is it kind of it's an insurance policy. That's why it's called insurance. It means that you pay a small amount up front. If anything goes wrong, you're supported. And one of the things that I often hear, and I was taught on my course, was that although placements have insurance, it's their insurance. So they choose whether to activate it or not. And I was told a story many years ago of a student who had a complaint made against them. And the student then said, well, I need to activate the insurance. And the organisation agreed with the clients about the complaint and wouldn't activate their insurance. So basically, the student was in a very difficult position. So my advice would be always to have your own insurance. And it is an ethical imperative. A lot of professional bodies now, under the Professional Standards Authority framework, have in their codes of practices, you need indemnity insurance. And they don't say for qualified practitioners, they say you need indemnity insurance. So I would suggest you buy your own. And there is some good news. A lot of insurance companies give discounts to students because they're students. And certainly some of the rates quoted in our Facebook page are a lot less than I pay as a qualified practitioner. I can tell you that. I was sorely thinking of going back and saying, well, I'm still a student, really. I do CPD. Can I have that? Can I have that rate? And I think at the time of recording this, someone mentioned £40, and that might seem a lot of money to some people, and I really do get that. But bearing in mind, if you have a professional complaint against you, you may need to take a barrister with you. Some of the complaints that I've heard, there's a barrister that sits with you to be in your side. You need to take legal advice, and it's a very combative. It can be, not always, but it can be a very combative arena. And barristers ain't cheap. So I guess if anybody were to ask me, certainly a student, do I need my own insurance? I'd say, I know it's more money, but yes.
Yeah.
And I think it just gets you into the habit of being, because you're not going to be a student forever. You'll qualify at some point, and then it just becomes a very good habit to have. I have my insurance, so I'm okay. I'm with a professional body, that's good, and I do my CPD. So you're going to be on the right side of things.
Yeah, and insurance boils down to we're really hoping for the best, but we plan for what is the worst outcome. And the worst outcome is where you need legal assistance or a complaint is made against you, and it costs money to be able to put your point over and say how it was for you. And that's when that insurance is literally practice saving. And here's the thing, said it so many times on this podcast, going to say it again for this topic. From the very moment that you see your first client, you're in practice. You're in practice. You might be sat within an agency or an organization, but you are in practice. And here's the secret. It's your practice. It's not the agency's practice. It's you, because you are there with that client. If the client chooses to levy a complaint, they levy it against you as a practitioner with your ethical body. So it's worth thinking about that. And the insurance covers you and your practice if you ever need it. And you mentioned, Rory, the story of an agency maybe having insurance cover, but they're not activating it. So here's something that I wouldn't, please don't tell anybody this, Rory. This is just between you and me.
All right, okay.
The other day I was at our local underground parking in our little town. And as I was pulling out of the parking, I misjudged the pole that was on the side, and I put a little bit of a scrape and ding down the side of my car. Oh, it was so painful. The noise and everything. I stopped and I got out and I looked, and it's a superficial scratch. But I know that if I take that in and claim on my insurance, it's going to be probably £1,000, if not more, because they need to take the panel off and do the whole process. And I chose to leave the scratch and not drill down on my insurance. Why did I do that? Because when you start claiming on your insurance, you lose what's called a no claims bonus, and it can make your insurance go up. I know, because my daughter had a bit of a bumper bashing you recently, and her insurance nearly doubled. She's 20, so she's in those early years of driving. So it makes sense that maybe an agency might not think it appropriate to go and kind of drill down on their insurance. And where does that leave you? Where if it's your practice and your insurance, the person who makes the decision is you. And I think that is the most important part of that, Rory.
Absolutely. And I think that also insurance companies, we don't have insurance just for the bad things. I think a lot of insurance companies now have information and support. You can ask them questions. So maybe your placement is with young people. Yeah. So you may go and speak to your insurance company and say, am I insured for young people?
Yeah. And
they may come back, as they did with me when I was a school counsellor, and say, yes, but you need this, that, and this and that in place. And I remember having quite a long conversation with my insurance company at the time, because they wanted me to disclose everything the client said to the parent. And I said, I can't do that. Yeah. As long as they're Gillick competent. And eventually, I've still got it in my filing cabinet somewhere. They rewrote my insurance with a separate clause in their underwriters, the people who look at the risk and then put together the contract of insurance, wrote me, not because it was me in particular, but because I brought this up and they thought, oh, that's a really good point. Perhaps we haven't thought of that. They actually wrote me a clause. I had a separate clause put in my contract. And also, if you're in the online and telephone counselling world, if you're, once you qualify and you work abroad, is there anything you need to know from an insurance point of view? So they can be very, very, very handy. And also, if you have your notes sequestered, you can phone the insurance company up. And when I had mine, they were very, very helpful and very, very insightful. Because our colleagues in the police asked for my notes. So I immediately phoned my insurance company up and they said, have you sent them, in quite a panic voice? And I said, no. And then there was and I said, yes. And she said, you do know the law around it, don't you? And I said, yes, I do. She said, we suggest you respectfully write to our colleagues in the police and say, they have to be by a court order, or ideally, the client can get them and then send them on to you. So they can be very helpful. You can get quite a lot for your money, I think, in terms of securing your practice and sleeping well at night.
Yep.
To be honest.
Yeah, very much so. And insurance for your counselling practice is usually quite specialised. So if you're looking for an insurer, if you go online and you put in counselling practice insurance, you're going to see the regular players. They should be advertising or near the top there, or you can go into something like the Counselling Tutor Facebook group and ask if you're looking for insurance. A lot of people do that, and there's lots of different people with different providers who will say how that is for them. We don't recommend anybody in particular. That's not what we do here. We just hold the discussions about these topics. But if you do go onto Counselling Tutor website and just go to the search tab and put in the word insurance, you'll notice that we've done a number of podcasts on insurance, including having counselling insurers speaking about what they offer and why and what the benefits of that are. And I often think of it like choosing your ethical body. You've got a choice when it comes to insurance, and it's not just the insurance cover, as Rory has just mentioned. What else do they offer that's going to support you as a counsellor? And have a look at that and see what the benefits are that you can get, because as Rory has pointed out, some of them are really good. on the ball. And in some cases, I know certain practitioners will phone their insurer before they get hold of the ethical body. They'll phone the insurer first. And that's not unusual. And if you think about it, when you are in a counselling relationship, so I'm going to say face-to-face in the room, in that very same room is your supervisor. They're not there physically, but they're there as part of it, because you're going to be taking that a part of maybe that client's work to your supervisor. Your ethical body is there in that room with you because you're working to their framework, and your insurer is there. Your insurer is there with you as well, because if anything goes wrong and you need to call upon that, so you are protected within that room by your supervisor, your ethical framework that you work within, and of course your insurer as well. So choose the insurer that fits for you. And I sometimes see it being purchased as a grudge purchase. Oh, I've got to get insurance. I tell you, it is a bit of a grudge to pay, because it's expensive. Life is expensive these days. Counselling training is expensive, specifically if you're a student. And but I tell you, when it's not a grudge is when you need it. Then it is a relief. Because I can almost, I don't know what a barrister costs per hour, Rory, but I can almost imagine it's many, many, many years of insurance premiums for one half day of a barrister's time. So if you ever do need it, it's really important that it is there for you. Anything else on insurance, Rory, before we back out?
Well, I think I just agree with you. You know, in times when I've had an ethical dilemma, my first stop is the insurance company.
Yeah.
You know, and then my second stop is my supervisor, and my third stop is my ethical body, because I want all my ducks in a row, effectively. And you know, the thing is that when you're activating the insurance, you're activating a legal mechanism, because you know you may, you know, I don't want to scare people here. But, you know, the idea of having insurance is, you know, if you are sued in a civil court, you're going to have to, you know, you're going to have to get legal advice. You're going to have to get, may have to pay, in which case your insurance company, like when you hit the pole, Ken, you may have to pay out. So, you know, so it's always a good thing. And you can just practice with confidence. You may never need to activate it. I've never needed, in all the years I've practiced, and lots of other people I know have never needed it. Rather like my car insurance, he touches wood as he speaks. But you know, if you need it, it's there. It's there. That's why it's called insurance.
And that brings us to the end of Student Services. Thank you for joining us. This is the Counselling Tutor Podcast. You have joined us for episode 290.
Yes, we started off with ethical, sustainable practice and 5 reasons to become a trauma-informed counsellor. Ken and myself discuss why it's important, or why you should think about becoming a trauma-informed practitioner in the service of your clients. Practice Matters was an interview with Dorothy Hodgkinson, who is working with transgender people and brings some real insights into how to support that growing and more visible cohort of clients. And then finally, in Student Services, why students should have their own insurance. Now, before you go, if I can ask you a bit of a favour, first, if you've enjoyed and benefited from our conversation today, leave us a 5-star review on whatever platform you're tuning in from. It helps us reach more ears and it grows our community. And second, if anyone in your circle, a friend or maybe a practitioner, might benefit from our discussion, just share the podcast on their social media platforms, or drop them an email with a link to it. And we realise that word of mouth is so powerful. So we really do appreciate every share, tweet, post that brings in new listeners. And we really appreciate us being a part of your practice journey. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.